My name is Steve Breckler, and I am the Executive Director for Science at the American Psychological Association. I want to welcome you all to this briefing on standards for educational and psychological testing. The American Psychological Association, that's APA to our friends, works to advance the creation, communication, and application of psychological knowledge to benefit society and improve people's lives. Our partners in this work are the American Educational Research Association, or AERA, and the National Council on Measurement in Education, or NCME for short. AERA is a national research society that works to advance knowledge about education, encourage scholarly inquiry related to education, and promote the use of research to improve education and serve the public good. NCME is a professional organization for individuals involved in assessment, evaluation, testing, and other aspects of educational measurement. NCME members are involved in the construction and use of standardized tests, new forms of assessment, including performance-based assessment, program design, and program evaluation. Collectively, we represent well over 100,000 scholars and professionals in our fields. Our partnership extends over a period of decades and several editions of the standards for educational and psychological testing. We devote staff and other resources to bring the world's leading experts together in producing each new volume of the standards. We are fortunate to have with us here today several of those who have a long history of involvement with the standards. Before I introduce our first speaker, I do want to acknowledge one person behind the scenes who really deserves special credit for making this happen. It is a monumental task to revise and edit each new edition of the standards, convening expert writing panels, soliciting public review and commentary, editing, and then more review. APA's Director of Testing and Assessment is Marianne Ernesto, who's here with us today, and she is the one who really made this work. And I also want to give a special thanks and recognition to Senator Elizabeth Warren and her staff, especially Ashley Coulombe, for their help in making this wonderful, beautiful venue available to us today. Each of our three organizations contributes a representative to a standing management committee, which is responsible for advising us, monitoring the testing environment, and alerting us when the need for a revision is evident. The management committee then provides the oversight for each revision. The current chair of the management committee is Dr. Wayne Camara. Dr. Camara is the senior vice president of research at the ACT. He knows more about the standards than just about anyone, having been involved himself in the last two editions. Dr. Camara will tell us now about the history of the standards and the role of the management committee in making this happen. Dr. Camara.
Thank you, and thank you for those remarks, Steve, and especially thank you for our representatives from the Joint Committee on the Testing Standards who worked tirelessly for several years in getting this revision to be reality. Let me begin by talking a little bit about the history of the standards. And the 2014 standards are really the 6th edition of this document and the 5th time that these three associations have collaborated on such a document. The history of them can be traced down to 1954, when the American Psychological Association issued technical recommendations for psychological tests and diagnostic techniques, followed about 6 to 9 months later by the AERA and NCME, which issued similar technical recommendations for achievement tests. The goal of the initial technical documents were to aid test users in the selection and the evaluation of existing off-the-shelf tests for clinical use and educational uses. In 1966, the three associations collaborated and agreed that it made much more sense and would be much more timely to have a joint set of standards. And that was actually the first issue of the joint testing standards, followed by 3 revisions in 1974, 1985, and most recently in 1999. In each of these additions or revisions, the most eminent professionals in measurement, in assessment, in statistics, and practitioners in terms of the knowing about the appropriate uses and the type of evidence that's required to support such uses have chaired or been members of these committees. And so I really would like you to join me in thanking these individuals as representatives of this current committee. The purpose of the standards has always been to guide sound and ethical use of tests and to help evaluate the quality of tests and testing practices, to identify the particular uses that tests have been designed to support, and then to provide supporting evidence for those uses. They provide the definitive and the most widely accepted set of technical and scientific professional and operational standards that cover most types, if not all types, of assessments that are professionally developed across a variety of settings. Those settings include, among them, clinical practice, industrial or personnel uses, school psychology, educational assessment, both individual and large scale, including accountability tests, as well as certification and licensing. They apply to all types of techniques, whether they're standard multiple choice tests, performance assessments, and other assessment methods that are used to make important decisions about adult students, organizations. They apply to professional test developers, sponsors, publishers, and users, providing criteria to evaluate tests, the testing practices, and the effects of test use. And we think it's important at this time especially to point out that policymakers, ed reformists, foundations, business leaders, the media, all entities that speak aggressively or intelligently even about the potential uses of tests and their application pay particular attention to what are in these standards. And we hope that this event is one of the ways that we promote such awareness of appropriate practices and assessment. The standards were not directly established in response to an express government or regulatory need or in response to any legislation or judicial decisions. Although the standards have been cited in Supreme Court and lower court decisions regarding assessment practices, as well as regulatory guidance such as Goals 2000 and Title I of ESEA. Today, nearly any state assessment response for proposal that's issued seems to cite the standards and seems to require that developers and users adhere to the practices in terms of the development of the assessments, the design of the assessments, and the use of the assessments in those practices. In closing, I wanted to talk a bit about the Joint Committee and their appointment. First, if you have a copy of the standards, Roman numeral 7 will give you a list of all the members who were involved in this committee and members of the management committee who also assisted me in overseeing some of the project. It's important to know that the management committee and the three associations put a call for comments out in 2008. The call for comments encouraged individuals widely, not just members of the association, but all individuals concerned and aware of testing, to review the 1999 standards and identify recommendations or areas of improvement. In which ways has science or practice changed since 1999, and how should the standards and scientific and technical recommendations deal with those changes? In 2011, and those comments, by the way, were reviewed by the Joint Committee. In 2011, the Joint Committee developed their first draft revision of the standards. Again, it was widely available and reviewed by, again, well over 100 individuals and organizations. That feedback was incorporated. Each comment that was received by the committee was responded to, and there was an articulated argument or response that acknowledged whether that recommendation would be accepted or accepted in part, or if it was not accepted, why not? Members of AERA, APA, and NCME with expertise in substantive areas of measurement and assessment comprise members of this committee. The members were appointed by the Management Committee, but were not specifically asked to represent their associations. Rather, they were asked to represent the science and best practices of the fields of assessment and measurement. They all represent a tremendous amount of depth and breadth in the knowledge of assessment practice, whether it is certification, large-scale educational assessment, accountability, or personnel selection, as well as the basic measurement and scientific practices of testing. And now I'd like to introduce Barbara Plake, who along with Lori Wise were co-chairs of the standards, and they will follow with Laurel Hamilton, who's also a member of the committee, and they will each review some of the major substantive changes in the standards.
Thank you, Wayne. I had the great good fortune to work with my colleague Lori Wise and to serve as co-chairs for the joint committee that constructed this revised 2014 version of the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. My task today is to tell you some of the major changes that are contained in the 2014 standards, and also to identify some key features or key elements within the standards. It might help, before we get started talking about major changes, to say a little bit about the organization of the standards. I know most of you should have picked up a copy of this as you came in. The standards start with an introduction and end with a glossary, and in between there are 13 chapters. That's because we weren't superstitious that we could have 13 chapters that address different features or components of assessment. Those 13 chapters are divided into 3 parts. Part 1 covers foundations. These are the basic principles that apply to almost all testing situations, and they comprise chapters on validity, reliability, and fairness. The next part, Part 2, contains chapters that we called operations, and those are the steps or the processes that should be in place to help achieve those fundamental principles of reliability, validity, and fairness. The last section is called applications, and in that section, specific applications of the standards are called out for particular practices, for example, psychological tests and assessment. Workplace assessment, that includes both employment testing and testing for credentialing. Educational tests and assessment, and then that lucky 13th chapter is on policy uses, program evaluation, and accountability issues. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk now about some of the major changes. First of all, we took the chapters in the 1999 section on fairness. There were 3 of them that talked about fairness in general, and then applications of fairness for examinees that had disabilities or special needs, and then a chapter devoted to people from diverse language and cultural backgrounds. In the 2014 standards, those topics and others were consolidated into a unified chapter on fairness and moved into the foundations section. And so now we stand firmly that it's validity, reliability, and fairness that serve as the cornerstones of the principles for good testing practice. We also address some of the treatments of emerging technologies in testing. Now we're seeing a lot of testing that involves delivery of tests on computers. But beyond delivery of tests on computers, there's also a field of automated test assembly, automated scoring, automated score reporting. These are all things that have become more and more prevalent since the 1999 standards because of the emergence of this new technology. We also are talking about adaptive testing. This is testing where the tests are tailored to the ability of the individual. Sort of no longer is there a one-size-fits-all mentality in assessment. And so the 2014 standards also talk about that. Oh, I'm sorry. I was clicking, but it wasn't clicking with me. As you'll hear later, there is in the chapter on policy issues, program evaluation, we now emphasize accountability uses of tests, and Laura is going to be providing a lot more information about that. Other key changes that are in the 2014 standards, we didn't change the concepts and precepts around reliability, but we did phrase them in a slightly different fashion. We wanted to talk about reliability in the notion of consistency. Would you expect this particular topic that you're measuring to stay consistent over time? Would you expect it to stay consistent over occasions? If you pull different items from the domain, would you expect the scores to be consistent? So we're really kind of talking about a generalizability of the scores over different kinds of factors that might influence the interpretation. And the treatment of reliability focuses on the kind of idea of generalizing over different kinds of factors. In the employment workplace chapter, we integrated in the chapter information that applies to employment testing. Those are tests that try to match the candidate's skills with the job demands. With those that, now that's different from when you're trying to identify whether a person has the competencies to warrant licensure or certification. And so in the workplace environment, we try to differentiate when standards were appropriate in both situations and when they were specific to employment or more specific to credentialing. Another key feature in the 2014 standards is an organizational feature. In the standards, each chapter starts with some text that gives a background and substance to the topic that these standards are about. Once you get into the standards, in the 2014 standards, we introduced two important features. First, the standards follow in parallel with how the content is talked about in the chapter. So if something's talked about early, it's going to appear early in the standards. We also clustered those standards into coherent themes. So the standards are collected that talk about the same kind of issue. We saw this as a means for aiding in interpretation and usability of the 2014 standards. Now, I've been focusing on things that have changed or key features, but there's also in the standards many things that didn't change. And in part, that's not because we fell asleep at the wheel, but because a lot of things don't change over time when you're talking about fundamentals such as reliability and validity. And Lori's going to specifically focus on the treatment of validity in the 2014 standards.
So you can see how things worked. I was happy to be the co-chair with Barbara. I'm Laurie Wise from Humro, and I'm also currently serving as president of NCME, one of the sponsoring organizations. And Barbara did about 2/3 of the work, and I, helped her out as needed. Our task was also made quite a bit easier by the way in which the management committee polled the different organizations and gave us a very focused charge to address, and actually created the charge and then helped select the experts that would best be able to meet that charge. So we had a great committee to work with, and that was fairly easy, but part of the charge was not, let's rewrite the standards from the ground up. It was, let's focus on some areas where there have been changes and it needs a fresh look. So the one area where, frankly, things didn't change much was the area in validity. Validity is a central concept. The 1999 standards went quite a ways in presenting a more integrated view of validity and not getting away from the discrete types of validity evidence. And the new standards don't change that much. And yet we're going to talk about it in a little bit because validity is one of the central concepts that's touched on. And in fact, the major change was to make validity even more central by making sure that each of the other chapters in the foundations and in the operations sections referred back to validity and made clear that there's an overarching principle of supporting validity. That's why we do these things in test design, or why we do these things in scaling and equating, or why we do these things in other areas. So in the interest of leaving a little bit of time for questions, or a significant time for questions at the end, let's move on. We've selected 3 areas from the new version of the standards that we want to talk about in a little more depth, not just because they're new, but because they're important. And so Barbara will talk first about the area of fairness and go into some greater detail about what you need to know and what test developers and publishers and test users need to know to be sure that we are using tests in a manner that's fair to all. I'll talk a little bit more about validity, and then finally Laura Hamilton will talk about the program evaluation and accountability chapter. So without further ado, back to you.
Well, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that one of the major changes in the 2014 standards was how we situated fairness in the document, putting it in the foundations section. We did this in part because we fundamentally believe that fairness is one of the major foundational constructs that need to be attended to in order for a test to be of high quality. But we also did this because in those comments that Wayne referred to that came to the management committee in preparation for beginning the revision process, there were many comments about providing attention in the assessment process, not only for individuals with disabilities or individuals with diverse cultural backgrounds and languages, but to provide fair access to the test for all individuals in the intended assessment population. And we took that to heart. We spent time thinking, well, we have to make a chapter for ensuring that young children have appropriate access. Well, what about adults? Well, what about males and females? And it became a decision that, now this is the wrong direction. What we have to do is think about this from a unified, integrated perspective of fairness for all. We focused on the notion of removing elements in the assessment practice that would interfere with the examinee's ability to clearly demonstrate what they know and are able to do. That's what we're trying to measure. And if there are features in the assessment design, in the assessment administration, that confound the ability to have the knowledge of what the candidates know and are able to do, then in our field we call that construct irrelevant variance. But what I'd like you to think about this as irrelevant pieces of information that distorts what you want to know about the examinee based on the test. So our intent was to look at fairness for all, bring it into the central positioning of a foundational concept, and treat that as a way of ensuring that we had good, valid assessment information for all examinees in the intended population for the test. Now, I've already told you that by doing so, we put that in the foundation section. I want to talk a little bit about accommodations and modifications, because these are vehicles, tools that assessment practice uses to help remove those features of the assessment that interfere with good assessment results for individuals for whom the assessment does not provide them with appropriate access or ability to demonstrate what they know and are able to do. Now, accommodation is a change in the assessment that does not disrupt what you're trying to measure. Sometimes this involves providing extra time. Sometimes it involves providing the ability for someone else to record what the examinee is trying to show. But the underlying construct, what you're trying to measure, isn't distorted. When a test is changed through an accommodation, the intent is that the scores from non-accommodated tests, the original test that was not changed, and the performance of students who took the accommodated version are interchangeable. They have the same meaning. On the other hand, if a test is changed in some ways more substantially, so that part of the construct is no longer being measured, then the full information that you're trying to get from the test is no longer in the assessment results. That's called a modification. Those modified tests may not produce scores that are comparable to the scores from the original test that was not accommodated. Now, as I said earlier, The main goal here is to remove barriers that inhibit, interfere with the ability of the examinee to demonstrate what they know and are able to do, what you're trying to measure on the test. One of the ways that these barriers can be removed, I talked about by adding extra time or having someone else help with the recording of the responses. But another way to do this is to design accessibility in the test from the very beginning. And there are some concepts in test development and design called universal design, the purpose of which is to build accessibility into the test so that the need for some of these accommodations may be minimized. They probably won't go away, but it may assist in making these tests more available, more accessible to all examinees. One of the motivations behind making tests available to all examinees came from the No Child Left Behind legislation, where in educational testing, it was now legally required that all students have an opportunity to participate in a state's testing program. Years before that, many students were excused from testing if it was felt that the test wasn't appropriate for the student. With this No Child Left Behind legislation, it required test developers, test administrators, testing policymakers to attend to all students in the educational system and make assessments accessible to them, thereby encouraging providing accommodations for those students when it was appropriate, providing modifications for the students if that was helpful in getting information about what the students know and are able to do. There's also the development of alternative assessments in education for students with significant cognitive disabilities. I'm not talking about that here, but I want to mention that in the educational assessment chapter 12 in the 2014 standards, we have quite a bit of documentation and standards around alternate assessment practices for students with significant cognitive disabilities. In the chapter to try and make people more sensitive to what we were trying to address, we wanted to encourage the thinking about accessibility for all students, all candidates, all individuals in the assessment practice. We expanded the examples. A lot of the examples from the 1999 standards talked pretty exclusively about individuals with disabilities, individuals with diverse language and cultural backgrounds. And that's in there too. But we brought in examples that made it clear that we were including young children and adults and gender and race and ethnicity, so that it was clear that we were broadening what we were thinking about when we wanted to address fairness. Now, another issue that we face front and center in the fairness chapter was opportunity to learn. And this is more clearly, if not exclusively, relevant in educational assessments, particularly high-stakes assessments, where individuals, high school students principally, may have to pass a test in order to be eligible for high school graduation or other very high-stakes decisions. And we were concerned that if we didn't mention that opportunity to learn needs to be a consideration in the interpretation of student test scores, that it appeared to us to be fundamentally unfair to hold students accountable for curriculum content that they did not have an opportunity to learn. And that is also part of what we address in fairness in the 2014 standards. I'm going to turn this over to Lori, who's going to expand more on validity.
So validity, as I said earlier, is central to pretty much everything in testing and assessment. Without validity, we have nothing. So what is validity? And let me, first of all, present the focus that the Joint Committee took in describing validity in the validity chapter. Validity evidence is required to support interpretations of test scores for intended uses. So if you have different scores, different interpretations of those scores, and different uses of those scores, you may need different types of evidence to establish that these are, in fact, valid interpretations for these uses. This is really not much different, as I said earlier, from what was in the 1999 standards, but if anything, it's a more central concern in each of the other chapters. Now, I'm going to go through a few sort of frequent questions that illustrate the application of validity, what kinds of evidence and why, and some of the misconceptions. So the first question is, well, what makes a test valid? Okay. Well, a test is not valid or invalid by itself. As I said, and specific interpretations of test scores are valid for particular uses. Now, the evidence required to demonstrate the validity of the scores for those uses will depend widely on the interpretations and the uses. For example, if you're going to use a test, interpret the scores to indicate whether students have mastered targeted content for a course, you typically want to look at alignment evidence to show that the questions on the test are in fact align and fully cover or evenly cover the content specifications for that course or for that grade or for that subject. So as we have adopted for K-12 the Common Core State Standards in many states, making sure that the questions on the test that assess student mastery of the Common Core Standards are in fact aligned and cover fairly and evenly the content standards. Another new idea is we're beginning to talk at the end of high school in the educational world about college and career ready. Well, this changes us from just an interpretation of mastery of a particular content to a prediction. And we're predicting that students who have this kind of a score could do well, have a reasonable chance of doing well in college or in career training or however we are technically defining college and career ready. So for this kind of an interpretation, we actually need correlational evidence. We need to be able to link the tests on the scores with some measures of the outcomes that we're trying to predict and show, in fact, that there's a reasonable correlation, a reasonable accuracy to these predictions to support the interpretation of college and career ready. In still other cases where we're trying to differentiate, as with diagnostic testing and subscores, we may need correlational internal and external evidence to show that, in fact, the measures we have correlate with other measures of the same construct more than they do with other measures of different constructs. So that's another type of evidence that supports yet another type of interpretation of test scores. Okay, so the big question, those of you in the field know consequential validity has been one of the more hotly debated topics. And is consequential validity validity or is it something else? And you'll see in the validity chapter that there is an important discussion and treatment of consequences, the importance of examining them, the importance of examining for unintended consequences. And we got criticized by some for talking about consequences at all in a chapter in validity. And we got criticized by others for having somewhat of a distinction between the focus of the validity of test scores for particular uses and an evaluation of the theory of action behind these uses. That is, consequences is really about, is the theory that you have for why it's a good idea to use these scores in a particular way, is that justified based on the chain of assumptions leading to the outcome that you hope to achieve? We were comfortable maintaining some distinction between the validity of the interpretations and the evaluation of consequences, because really different types of evidence is required for both things. At the same time, if you read carefully Chapter 1 of the standards, you'll see that we are embracing both as important areas to investigate as part of any testing program. So then a third question that we get asked, and I'm just trying to deal with these really simple questions. So how much evidence do you need to support the validity of a test score interpretation for a particular use? And there is, of course, no precise answer to this question. Lots, you know, is what, if people are really pressed, I would say. But first, there's a couple of concepts here that we do endorse in our discussion of validity. First, validation is an open-ended process. You're never quite done. So there's some evidence that you clearly need to collect before you start using a test operationally, particularly for important uses. But then as you continue to administer the test, you need to continue to amass evidence to support the validity of the test score interpretations for the uses. So there are issues like test compromise. There's a variety of ways in which the validity of the interpretations can be threatened, and a continual and ongoing monitoring process is necessary. So it's the Validity Expert Full Employment Act, but validation is never done. Second point is that the more important the uses, the higher the level of evidence that's required. So if you're using information sort of diagnostically to tell people something interesting about themselves, but it doesn't really have any consequences, you might be able to live with relatively terse set of validity evidence. If, on the other hand, you're holding kids back in a grade or denying them a high school diploma or making some really important decision based on the test scores, then clearly a much more extensive validity evidence is required. And the final point is that much as we would like to lay out a sort of procedural way of dealing with and addressing validity, professional judgment is always going to be required regarding how to balance out supporting and contradicting evidence, and whether in the judgment of the professions the amount of evidence available in fact supports the interpretations and uses proposed. So again, we want to allow plenty of time for questions. I hope there'll be some about validity, but I think we want to get on to accountability, so I'll turn it over to Laura Hamilton.
Thanks, Laurie. So Barbara talked through some of the big changes in the areas that the 2014 committee was asked to focus on, and one of them was accountability. And that's in part because, as you all know, there's been an expansion in the use of tests for accountability in K through 12 education. No Child Left Behind resulted in states bringing on new tests and attaching consequences to them. The Race to the Top legislation sort of continued this. So within the public education realm, testing for accountability has become a very central sort of policy lever that we thought needed some attention. Also supporting this is advances that have been made in data systems and technology-based systems that allow schools and districts to store and analyze and produce reports on student achievement data. So if you look at a publication like Education Week or some of the journals that teachers and administrators subscribe to, you'll see all kinds of advertisements for these systems that, you know, will help your district do data-driven decision-making and, you know, produce test score reports that can be used to make decisions about curriculum and instruction. So this has become, you know, a central focus of school and district reform efforts, again, kind of raising the importance of thinking about how this information is used. And then, as was mentioned earlier, there's been this growing emphasis on measuring teacher effectiveness, in large part as a result of a growing body of research that suggests that individual teachers differ quite a bit in their contribution to student achievement gains. And as a result of this, when folks think about accountability now, there's a desire to push that down to the level of the individual educator rather than just thinking about accountability at the school or district level. How can we measure teachers' effectiveness and somehow hold them accountable for that? And that obviously has lots of high stakes consequences, and so we really wanted to make sure that we were touching on that. I want to mention, even though we think a lot about testing for accountability in education, particularly at the K through 12 levels, it is used quite a bit in other contexts. And so there's discussion now about how do we measure student learning in undergraduate education, instruments like the collegiate learning assessment people are thinking about. Are there ways to use that as an accountability tool? In the behavioral health arena, there's growing use of inventories like depression inventories or other mental health measures to try to measure provider effectiveness. So to look at gains that providers, patients receive on those measures and use that as kind of a rating tool. So it's similar to what we're doing in education. You know, one really important thing to keep in mind here is that when we think about the consequences of tests, we often think about the test taker, what's going to happen to the examinee as a result of this performance. But in this arena, we really need to also think about the consequences for the people who are providing service to them, whether it's the teachers, the healthcare provider, and so forth. So the test performance of the students can have direct consequences for the lives of the providers of services, and that needs to be addressed. So as Barbara mentioned, there is a chapter, it's the last chapter in the standards, on program evaluation, policy studies, and accountability. And so this is the one that's most relevant, and if you're someone who's thinking about designing an accountability system, that might be the chapter you'd turn to, and it's got lots of specific examples that are relevant. But the chapter right before that is on educational testing, and there's lots of relevant material there as well, particularly for tests that have stakes for individual students. Tests that are used for determining high school graduation or promotion. That chapter also covers some of the interim and benchmark tests that I'll talk about in a minute. That said, it's really important for users of these tests and designers of accountability systems to be familiar with the whole volume, because a lot of the things that are discussed in those foundations chapters that Lori and Barbara described are clearly relevant to accountability testing, as are many of the issues that are discussed in some of the other chapters around test use and scoring and administration and so forth. So we want to make sure people understand that the accountability material is not limited to a single chapter. It really draws on the entire set of standards. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some specific issues that have come up. And so, you know, this use of value-added modeling or value-added measures, often called VAM, is something that's getting a lot of attention these days. The way we tried to deal with this is to use a phrase that we sort of come up with the phrase accountability index. And the idea here is that an accountability index is something that combines information from multiple sources or that applies some kind of complex statistical modeling to produce either a number or a label that's then used to make an inference and a decision about someone. So that could be a numerical quantity like a value-added measure. It could be a label like the adequate yearly progress or AYP labels that are used under No Child Left Behind. The important thing to keep in mind here is that when you're thinking about how the standards apply, it's important to note that they apply not just to the underlying test scores that are used to form those indices, but they apply to the indices themselves. So for example, if you're creating teacher value-added measures using a standardized math test, you do want to know that the math test has good technical properties, tells us something we want to know about how much math kids are learning, has a high degree of reliability for kids. But once you take that information and you statistically manipulate it and you create a VAM, now you're making a different kind of inference. You're saying this number is telling me something about not what kids have learned, but it's telling me what teachers have contributed to those students' learning. So the inference is about what the teacher did, and the decision you're going to make is probably about something that'll have consequences for the teacher. And so therefore, we want to think about all of the standards in terms of fairness, validity, reliability, and so forth as they apply to that index, and not just as they apply to the underlying quantity. I also wanted to mention that one chapter that's not often looked at by folks in education is the chapter on workplace testing. We often just skip right over that. But in fact, if you think about how value-added modeling is used now, it's really used in workplace decisions. In many districts, this information is being used to inform decisions about teacher tenure, hiring, placement, professional development, and so forth. And so some of the standards that are in the workplace chapter are actually quite relevant. One example is, it raises the need for some sort of link between the content of the measure and the job requirements. And so one example that came to mind as I was looking at that is there are lots of districts that are struggling with the fact that they don't have achievement tests for teachers in all subjects and grades. They've got math and reading tests for certain grades. But if you're an art teacher, your district may or may not have tests that can be used to create a value-added measure for you. One solution to that is that you calculate a school-wide measure based on math and reading, and you sort of assign that to all of the teachers in the school. Now, if you're going to do that, in order for that to be defensible, you need to be able to say something about the extent to which your art teachers should be held responsible for the math and reading gains of their students. You could come up with an argument for why that might be the case, but it's important to be able to make and defend that argument if you're going to use the test in that way. Another standard that appears in the workplace testing chapter has to do with using test scores to classify people and place them into different job categories. So an analogy in education is that we're going to take the teachers with the top 10% of teachers in terms of our evaluation system, and we're going to assign them to be mentor teachers. Well, again, if you're going to make that kind of a decision, you need to be able to argue convincingly that this measure that you're calculating for your teachers tells you something about that teacher's likely effectiveness in that particular role. So we're hoping that these standards will generate some discussion among the folks who are designing these policies and implementing them, and help them think more clearly about what kind of evidence is really needed for these different uses. Another topic that has come up is the use of interim or benchmark tests, sometimes called formative assessments. These, again, we're seeing lots of vendors now who are providing selling systems to schools that allow them to administer tests on an interim basis, often as a way of predicting which kids are on track to meet the standards at the end of the year. The new Common Core aligned assessment consortia, Smarter, Balanced, and PARC, offer these kinds of tests that can be given over the course of the year. The main purpose of these is really generally to inform instructional decisions, to help teachers figure out what kids' strengths and weaknesses are so that they can adjust their instruction. And these tests are covered mostly in Chapter 12, the educational chapter in the standards. But one of the things that's really important here that comes up in Chapter 12 as well as elsewhere in the standards is the need to provide information to users of tests to help them understand what inferences are and aren't supported by the use of that test. And I think a good example in this area is the use of subscores. So oftentimes what will happen is you'll have a 30-item math test, a benchmark test, and you'll get back for each kid not just a total score, but a score on numbers and operations and geometry and algebra. So it'll break it down. And teachers love this kind of information because it's much more informative to know that your student is, doing really well in algebra and struggling with geometry than it is just to know a total score. At the same time, oftentimes these subscores are comprised of 3 or 4 items, and so the degree of reliability is questionable. And that's the kind of information it's really important to give back to teachers in a form that they can understand so that they're making appropriate decisions based on these results. One of the things we struggled with a little bit in the committee is thinking about when do the standards apply when you're talking about testing that occurs in the classroom? So we didn't want people to read the standards and think that every time a teacher creates an end-of-unit test, he or she needs to run out and do a big comprehensive validity investigation on the test. That would be a little unreasonable. So as was discussed earlier, you know, the extent to which you want really solid evidence of reliability, validity, and fairness depends to a large degree on the stakes that are attached, the kind of decisions that you're going to make. And so we want there to be evidence to support the specific uses that you're putting tests to. You know, I think one of the goals is to sort of avoid having people use tests for purposes that they weren't designed and validated for. There's a lot of temptation to do that now if you've got a good data system and it's giving you information back. You know, the district superintendent is pushing data-driven decision-making, so if you're a principal, you know, there's a very rational temptation to use these scores for all sorts of things that maybe they weren't designed for. So informing users of that, and, you know, recognizing that teacher-developed tests face different requirements in terms of meeting the standards than we would apply to something like a commercial benchmark test that's being, you know, marketed and sold for use in districts across the country. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is technology, which Barbara had mentioned as another sort of change in the most recent version of the standards. We see assessments increasingly using technology for all aspects ranging from administration to scoring to reporting. This was the one area where the Standards Committee actually brought in some external experts to help us think about these issues, which are pretty complicated. And we read through and reviewed all of the standards, you know, keeping this issue of technology-based testing in mind. And to a large degree, you know, we found that the standards really did fit whether the test was paper and pencil or technology-based. The general principles are the same. But there were some areas where, you know, we wanted to try to address the technology issues specifically. And so you'll see if you look through the standards, there's some information about test security as well as data security, recognizing the potential for breaches resulting from the way we now administer and store both the tests and the data from the tests. Automated scoring of open-ended items was a big one. You know, and this is tricky because, you know, vendors have and test publishers have developed pretty complicated algorithms for scoring essays using the computer. And we sort of struggled with how that should, you know, what we should expect test publishers to report on that. You know, on the one hand, there's a recognition that those algorithms are proprietary to some degree, and also that putting out too much detail could actually encourage a sort of gaming of the system among examinees. If you really know how this algorithm's working, you might be able to game it in a way that gives you a high score without necessarily, you know, showing mastery of the content that the test is designed to measure. However, the standards do have some guidance in there about what should be reported. You know, so for example, publishers who use these algorithms should at a minimum be reporting what characteristics are evident in scores at different levels of performance using these algorithms. So what do we know about an essay that receives the top score, say a 5 on a 1 to 5 scale? What are the characteristics of that essay? How do they differ from an essay that receives a 4 or a 3? So in general terms, so that examinees can get a sense of what's expected. There also should be evidence of empirical support for the use of these algorithms. So one example might be agreement rates between the use of this automated algorithm and scores assigned by a well-trained human rater. And if that agreement is weak, that raises questions about either the rater or the algorithm, or both. But that's the kind of thing that should be reported even if the algorithm itself isn't. Automated score reporting is another topic that has come up, not only in the education setting, but also in the clinical setting. There are you know, assessments that examinees take themselves, and you get a printout of your scores with some interpretive information, and maybe that's all you get. And so one issue there is making sure that the examinees understand the rationale for the scores that are given and understand the limitations. So if you're going to do this all on a computer without any sort of human intervention, you want to make sure that you're providing the information to test takers and test users that allows them to interpret it in an appropriate way. And that's all I have, so I will turn it over to Wayne.
Now we'll be opening it up to questions. Before we do, I just wanted to re-emphasize something I touched on, but I thought it was really important enough to really emphasize, in that the way that I see the standards for educational and psychological testing as qualitatively different than many of the committee reports that you probably get briefed on by different scientific bodies, is that the report is not just truly authored by the 15 experts who are noted here. But if you turn to the Roman numeral pages 8 and 9, you'll see a list of an extensive number of organizations. Each of those organizations has committees or individuals with specific expertise in maybe neuropsychological testing, or testing with the elderly, or testing with individuals with learning disabilities. You'll see licensing and credentialing bodies that have developed tests that regulate entry to the field or certify an individual as being competent to practice in various fields. You'll see a lot of organizations such as testing publishers that develop tests. You'll see state governments. You'll see a whole host of organizations. Plus, within the sponsoring associations, these standards went through extensive review. So not only was there an initial call for comments, there was also a concerted review, for example, within the American Psychological Association itself. I would guess that possibly up to 1,000 different psychologists with expertise in some area related to assessment looked at these standards, gave comments or criticism, and those comments and criticisms and suggestions were reviewed by this committee. And I think the end result that you have here is not just something that was authored by very distinguished scientists and researchers and practitioners, but was made infinitely better by the hundreds and possibly thousands of individuals who contributed in a secondary or a third level fashion to these standards. So they truly do represent endorsement by large governance groups of the associations, and an effort by these three associations to collect and solicit feedback from the widest possible audience of individuals, organizations, and experts who have a stake in high-stakes testing. So I wanted to make sure that that was emphasized, because I do think it differs from a traditional scientific or educational report that's issued by many associations in the breadth and the depth of involvement in this field. With that said, I do now want to open it up to questions, and I'm hoping we'll have some folks. If you do have any questions, I'd ask you to please go to the microphone and introduce yourself. The reason we're doing that is we are taping this. It is on live WebEx, and we'd like the audience to capture that. So I'd welcome anyone to begin questions.
If you're in the audience, if you're in webcast, what do you need to ask?
Is there an opportunity for anyone on webcast to ask questions?
It's on the screen. No, not this screen.
I think if you are viewing this on WebEx and you submit a question, we will be able to get it from the side.
So who wants to be the first?
Yes.
I have two questions. One is, in coming to a consensus, were there any residual disagreements that are worth, you can't hear? In coming to a consensus, were there any residual disagreements that are worth mentioning to the community? The other question is a request for advice. We know that standards are not algorithms that you can just follow, but they are intended in earnest as ought statements to be taken into account. And one of the purposes of the standards is to provide a basis for evaluating testing that's going on. Something like the borough's mental measurements yearbooks have done for years. But independent testing people have done that too. But a major problem exists in that in the public schools, K-12 educational testing, while years ago it was the publisher that was responsible for most of the validation, today it's a State Department and a publisher together, and so the validity information is private and proprietary, and I don't know how testing community can get at an independent evaluation of them. And I wonder if you have any advice on what the community can do, given that serious thing that the intent of the standards is to be, not to be followed, but to be taken into account, and that means you should have access to validity information.
Oh, yes, okay. Let me say first that it really was useful to have individuals from very different areas of testing because they came in with some different views and different language. The whole issue of accommodations and modifications is treated somewhat differently in employment testing from the way it is in K-12 testing, and there were plenty of examples of that. That's part of what took us a while, is to come to a common consensus across these different viewpoints and uses. But I have to say at the end, there were no significant areas where there wasn't a full consensus, and there are no dissenting views, and it was pretty straightforward. Well, I mean, not straightforward. It was highly endorsed by every member of the committee. Yeah. So,
well, I have two things to say about your question. First of all, in my former life at the University of Nebraska, I was the director of the Burroughs Center for Testing, which, among other things, publishes the Mental Measurements Yearbook, which provides scholarly reviews, we call them candidly critical, reviews of all commercially available tests. And it was a struggle in that time period because we wanted to create a specific volume dedicated to evaluating tests that are used for state assessment programs. I believe that has changed dramatically as the state assessment programs have become more mature and more sophisticated. Most state departments of education put on their websites technical manuals that document the technical quality of their state assessment. So I think that's being resolved, if it's not already resolved, in state assessment programs. That validity evidence should be on the websites. And well, I don't know, Laura, if you want to respond. You're saying no, but should and is may be different. Yeah.
Next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Janine Moloch. And I think, one, I'm excited to see that the standards have been revised. I'm kind of piggybacking off of the person who preceded me in the question. I think the biggest challenge for a lot of the public is not necessarily the validity, reliability of the assessments being developed. There is a question whether that information is made available to the public in a manner in which it can be easily interpreted. But I think there seems to be a disconnect with those who are making the policy and those who are designing the assessments. And it's not always clear that the assessments are being used for the intended purpose. So a question that I have for you, perhaps the NCME portion or AERA, is do you provide counsel when we are making decisions such as going to the two consortia, in going to high stakes testing and testing in subjects for which there weren't assessments developed, and using them outside, using them in statistical modeling where inferences are being drawn that may not be accurate based on the assessment and the methodology being employed.
So I think it's a really tough question, and there's probably not a simple answer to it. I think the organizations themselves have tried to put out materials to help inform these decisions. So some years back, AERA had put out a statement on the use of tests for high-stakes decisions. Now the problem is that most of the people who are making these decisions or who are subject to them aren't reading materials that AERA puts out. So I think that, you know, the professional organizations have a role, organizations like the National PTA have a role, and I think that they've tried to get involved in these discussions, but they have limited influence, and there are always other bodies out there who are, you know, putting forth an alternative view as loudly. And so I think it makes it really difficult for educators, for parents, and everybody else who's affected by these tests to figure out, you know, to separate the good information from the noise and figure out what's really the right approach here.
Yeah, if I could add sort of two things. One is most of the states that have testing programs and the assessment consortia and almost and a variety of other testing programs have technical advisory committees who are experts that understand and know the content of the standards and help interpret the meaning of the standards in the context of the assessments that are being developed. So that is one mechanism that we go from just standards alone to making sure that that tests are implemented in a fair way. The other really exciting experiment is this thing called peer review, where the federal government is requiring states to provide evidence of accountability, reliability, fairness for the assessments that they use for, at least for statewide accountability. Now, many people were not totally enamored with the way that peer review rolled out the first time, and so the federal government's in the process of revising what's going to be the guidance, and we're all anxious to see it and to make sure that the evidence and the requirements that are laid out in peer review are consistent with the principles behind these standards.
The one thing I would add is someone who's worked in large testing organizations for over 20 years is that one thing I think that's a fundamental requirement of any test, whether it's a standardized test by a publisher or a state test or even an organizational test, is a very clear and concise statement of the intended uses and the appropriate uses of that test. And so the publisher, the development, or the sponsor of a test should lay out clearly what they believe the test should be used for, and then they should provide evidence to use that, such that when a third party comes along and says, we're now using this test for a purpose that's not identified, the burden then falls, depending on the use, on the test user, possibly the test developer, possibly both of them, but additional evidence needs to be used. What I find sometimes is a lack of that clear specificity of what is the primary and maybe the secondary purposes in a way that would allow one to easily evaluate and say, this organization says these are the three purposes of the test, but Senator, CEO, you're proposing a totally different use. Where is that evidence? That would, I think, improve things. The other area where I wouldn't know how to comment on is often government entities, could be the federal government, it could be a state government, will require a use for tests that may not be typical of available tests, and then clearly testing organizations that want to respond to that bid, there is an implicit pressure to propose uses or solutions in response to a government mandate, and I would love a mechanism so that states and federal agencies, before they issued such calls or requests for proposal, really consulted with the professions to ensure that there were tests available that could serve that purpose, and if not, that they could be developed. And I think those two steps would be things that could over time, maybe improve practice a bit. Next question.
Dr. Kelly Cummings, University of Maryland. I was hoping the committee could speak to any differences between the prior editions in terms of your recommendations around growth metrics, particularly since IDEA was reauthorized between the two editions.
Yeah, so the standards don't go into a lot of detail. In fact, they don't probably go into any detail on sort of how to create valid measures of growth, what kinds of tests need to be included if you're going to create a valid measure of growth. I think it gets back to, in my presentation, the discussion about accountability indices. And I think a growth metric is an example of that, where you want to collect information about the reliability and precision of that metric, how much does it change as you calculate it repeatedly, the validity in terms of supporting the kinds of inferences that you want to make on it, fairness issues, if you're calculating a school level growth measure, are you unfairly designated certain kinds of schools or schools serving certain kinds of students as being less likely to be successful on that metric compared with other schools. So it's a matter of thinking about the underlying test and whether the features of that test support calculating a growth metric. Obviously you don't want to, use completely different pre and post tests and call that growth. But beyond that, even if you've got that basic underlying test features, you want to be able to, evaluate the potential uses of it and the validity, reliability, and fairness evidence in support of those uses. You guys want to add?
Next.
Karen DeMoss, Wagner College in New York. And I'm wondering, I greatly appreciate you're putting the fairness chapter out there up front. I'm wondering whether or not there were any discussions about stereotype threat, because it doesn't appear either as a construct to be defined or anywhere in the appendix right now, in the indices.
I had a little bit of trouble hearing you, and was the question around stereotype threat?
Yes, it seems to me a pretty important piece that we know about how tests function for different groups, and it doesn't appear to be in the fairness section. I wondered what your conversations might have been around that.
We did discuss this at length, and in fact, there is an example in the fairness chapter that mentions in an example, it's in the text, not in the standards, about how stereotypes, I'm having trouble even saying it. Stereotype threat would be a factor to consider in the interpretations of tests. So we viewed it as in the light of making valid interpretations of test scores, just along this. I think it was in the same section where we were also mentioning about opportunity to learn as something you would need to take into account when you're interpreting test scores. So we clearly considered it. In fact, we had a special presentation on the topic during our deliberations.
Next question.
Yes, thank you for the great information. And through the passage of time, do you think there'll be any changes or progressions considering the increase in technology on how testing is delivered and or measured?
Well, so technology is continually evolving, and one of the challenges we had was to create standards that would state general principles that would be still applicable 5 and 10 years into the future, probably not much more than 10. So for that reason, we sometimes didn't get down to real specifics about the current best way of doing essay scoring or the current, current limit of the different types of item formats. I think we believe that the principles are there and that they should apply to new and emerging technologies. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't also be a lot of derivative products that focus the interpretations that are in the test standards on particular problems, and technology may be one area that's ripe for sort of an ongoing further explication beyond beyond the general principles that are stated in the current standards.
Next question.
Hi, Steve Cerisi, professor of psychometrics and educational measurement at University of Massachusetts Amherst. First of all, thank you to the committee. Your monumental work has just been incredible, and these standards really represent an important resource for not just the educational measurement practitioners, but psychological assessment and so forth. Aside from the peer review guidelines that Lori mentioned, there's really no enforcement mechanism for the standards or for other standards. So one question is, does the Joint Committee or any of the organizations individually have input into the U.S. Department of Education's revision of the peer review guidelines? Because I think they're very important, and of course we want them to be in step with the new standards. My other question is if there was any conversation during the development of the new standards or since then about anything the organizations can do to, I don't know if enforcement's the right way, but right now we've already heard mention of a couple of things like measures of growth, value-added estimates, and those sorts of things which probably violate some of the standards. For example, what Laura mentioned in the accountability chapter, it says that evidence to support these measures should be in place before they're used, and we don't see that. We see these measures being used, but without any evidence, which has to be frustrating to you and the committee who are putting out these guidelines. So is there a link between the Joint Committee or the organizations and the U.S. Department of Education on peer review, and is there any momentum for some way to try and get more enforcement of the standards?
Let me start, and then Barbara can give you the real answer. There's no direct link between the committee itself and the department or anybody else. We've put out these general principles that are embodied in the standards. That said, there are a lot of experts, not just the committee, that understand and will be commenting and assisting in the review and revision of whatever peer review standards come out of the department. And similarly, I think most credible testing programs have some sort of outside external advice that they receive that helps them interpret the extent to which what they're doing is in fact consistent or where it's not consistent with the principles and the standards.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Susan Poland. I'm from George Mason University. I love the section in Chapter 3 on opportunity to learn, but I quickly breezed through it. And I have a question about that. It doesn't seem like there's any sort of concrete ideas about how to implement any sort of fairness metric as far as opportunity to learn goes. Did you guys discuss at all any sort of ways to ensure there is opportunity to learn or to measure the opportunity to learn in your discussions about Chapter 3?
The quick answer to that is no, but I want to say it more emphatically and more broadly. The intent of the standards was to provide general principles towards practice, sort of the what you should do, but we did not feel that it was appropriate for us to dictate strategies in order to achieve those ends for at least two reasons, one of which is we believed that it was contextual. It may make a difference when and how and what the consequences are involved in opportunity to learn. And secondly, with the thought that this volume may need to have a shelf life of 5, up to 10, 12 years, what we would suggest now as strategies could easily become outdated. So our intent was not to tell you how to do it, but what you needed to think about when you were putting into place strategies and practices.
We have a number of questions, quite a few questions actually coming in from online, and most of them follow the ones that we've heard here, except for those who are asking how to get a free copy of the standards. But there were two that I think the group might want to address. One was about adaptability, actually several questions about adaptability, visually handicapped students and other kinds of handicaps, and how reliability and validity can be interpreted or used in situations of adaptability. And one suggestion was to have special tests for special students. And so.
Well, this question is closely related to the issues around accommodations and modifications, and in that sense, the question is whether through that adaptation of the test, the changes that are made in the test, are we changing what we're fundamentally trying to measure, or are we keeping that the same, but removing extraneous construct variables that aren't going to affect what the meaning of the test scores? And the standards are very clear that when the adaptation does not affect the construct, then the scores should be considered to be interchangeable and comparable. But in the context where that change distorts the construct, then it should be treated like a new test. This isn't the test of the old construct. This is a test of a new and different version of that construct, and you would need to gather validity evidence, you would need to gather reliability evidence, you would need to document that the scores support the intended interpretation. Now, it sounded like at the end of that question, there was some interest in special populations such as people with significant cognitive disabilities and the assessments that are designed to measure the standards that are appropriate for those assessments. Again, that defines the construct that's being measured, and the validity claims around what you're intending to measure, those all have, it's like another test, another whole assessment design, development, and validation process.
Next question.
I'm Rob Mapu. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist locally, and I specialize in assessment of learning disabilities and ADHD. I have a question that's a little bit different. A number of us met at Landmark College back in May to discuss the changing atmosphere in regard to documentation of disabilities, especially at the post-secondary level. What we've been concerned about is that policymakers and organizations and even legal decisions are watering down the use of psychometric testing and the application of psychometric principles in disability determination. A couple of examples of this include the recent guidelines for accommodation documentation from the Association on Higher Education and Disability that really states that our evaluation should not be a primary source of information about disability documentation. It should be based upon a student's self-report of problems and observations of others. In other words, just discarding any usefulness of psychometric testing. We're even seeing this in some of the legal decisions and policy recommendations that have been made. For example, the recent LSAT consent decree, which says that if someone has been granted accommodations on a college entrance examination and are asking for the same accommodations on the LSAT, they should automatically get that, even if those accommodations were granted based on testing that was done, say, when a person was in second grade, and accommodations that were continued all along. We're concerned that our ability as clinicians to help contribute to these decisions and provide reliable and valid data is really being very much watered down. And we all wondered whether there might be anything in the standards that we would be able to use to help buttress our findings, or are we just fighting an uphill battle with the changes in policy and even law?
From a standards perspective, we don't try to make policy practices about what constitutes appropriate decision-making strategies around who qualifies for accommodations or not. Instead, we state that it's the decision maker's responsibility to articulate what those policies are and follow them. And that's all that the standards say.
I would add, though, that I know there is some reference to the currency of assessment data and information. And so it may not be in the fairness chapter, but clearly one of the use cases you suggested was that bordered on the use of what I would call outdated assessment results. And so for someone who's entering college, using a test that is 5 or 10 years, administered 5 or 10 years earlier, would be somewhat difficult to justify in most professional situations. So there may be in the standards some documentation that would assist in particular issues like that.
It certainly makes sense to us in the fact that people change over time, that people change with intervention, that the second grader is not the same as the graduating high school student. But unfortunately, everything seems to be moving in the opposite direction, and it almost seems like it's being taken out of the hands of the people who are experts and put into the hands of the policymakers who are not expert on these issues. So we had hoped that there might be something there that we might be able to use. Well, I think as we peruse the standards in detail, perhaps we'll find something.
And I think the general flavor of these, and there's a separate set of guidelines that deal with employment testing that, in a sense, are subservient to these. But I think the general tone of these types of standards and the professional practice is not that higher standards apply to psychological or educational tests. And if you use something, a performance assessment, a structured interview, another technique that you can somehow skirt those responsibilities of validity, reliability, and fairness, I think that would I think that's rejected by the standards, by good professional practice. And actually, there was even a Supreme Court case in terms of employment actions where a firm used a structured interview, and the Supreme Court citing the standards, that one cannot simply use a subjective technique and claim that there's no method or no validation evidence required. So I think there are some precedents there, but I'm very sympathetic to the general issue.
We have two persons who are willing to translate the standards into another language, and several people who've asked, are they applicable to other countries' use in education and psychology testing, and have they been used in other countries?
There is a committee under the American Psychological Association that deals specifically with the use of tests in international settings. And we had, as Wayne mentioned, we received comments from a lot of groups, and one of those groups was the Committee on International Testing from the American Psychological Association. And they did raise some concerns when we were looking at earlier drafts of the standards, and we made changes in how we presented some of the concepts, in particular with regard to data analysis in supporting underlying structure of a construct. It was a concern on whether a construct had the same meaning in a different circumstance, in a different culture, in a different application. And that raised our awareness to the need to broaden our definitions around construct documentation. So we did attend to issues around international relevance of the standards. I do not know personally of examples where they've been used internationally, but I expect that that is the case.
So two things I would add. All three organizations have a substantial number of Canadian members. So if Canada counts as international, you know, we extend at least that far, and it's widely applied. More seriously, some of the experts in employment testing that were part of the committee work with multinational companies that create tests that are used for employment, you know, worldwide. And so there were issues and sensitivities that they brought up that we needed to attend to. And I believe also there's a little bit on translations that you'll find in fairness and some in test development. You know, as to whether somebody wants to, on their own, translate these standards into another language, I think that's an issue for the publisher, and what kinds of checks would there be to verify that the translated standards, you know, in fact, retain their original meaning. But I, for one, am all for as wide an application of these principles to testing throughout the world as possible.
Yes, next question.
Hello, my name is Leah Catherine Saul. I'm at
Could
Loyola.
you speak up a little bit?
Sorry. My name is Leah Catherine Saul. I'm at Loyola University, Maryland. I also appreciate the emphasis on context that these standards are clearly trying to outline. And my question is related to some of the questions about technology-driven assessment, particularly those related to individualized testing. And I was wondering if there were any directives regarding reporting of characteristics stratified by different diversity categories and how those were impacted during individualized testing scenarios in technology.
By individualized, are you meaning one-on-one testing, or can you say a little bit more? Or
Absolutely. So in those individualized testing environments, particularly those frequently that are related to adult testing, GED, ACT, I don't think the ACT uses it, but GRE, those tests that change the questions based on the individual tester. If you guys have requirements or recommendations on reporting of results stratified by different diversity categories.
we certainly do talk about the need to include different categories, different diversity categories, the whole range of examinees to which the interpretation is going to be applied, include them in the validity studies and in estimates of precision and so on. We also have a more extensive treatment of adaptive testing and some of the considerations that, you know, like doing a simple alignment study isn't quite so simple if different kids have different questions. But that said, I'm not sure.
The adaptive testing strategy, the goal is to get a more precise estimate of the individual's knowledge or competency by tailoring the assessment to be more closely matched to the ability of the examinee. However, the results are equated onto a common metric. And so anything that is germane to score reporting applies regardless of whether the strategy to get that score was from a linear test that had no differentiation in the items administered, or an adaptive strategy. The adaptive strategy is just a means to get what some would say is a better estimate of the competencies that you're trying to measure?
I would just add to that too that we discussed the issue of group reporting by different demographic categories as part of the accountability and program evaluation material as well. And so one of the standards in that chapter focuses on the need to provide enough contextual information to try to help people who are looking at those differences understand what the possible reasons might be. Is it something to do with the test and differences in those groups' ability to access the test from a fairness perspective? Is it something to do with opportunity to learn that might differ across those groups? So what might be, is there other information we can bring to this? And certainly, if it's from an adaptive test, you'd want that information to be provided so that users of it understand. But I think that following on what Laurie and Barbara said, that feature alone shouldn't have an impact on those differences.
I wanted to take a minute to just revive a question that was asked in that corner by Steve, and Laurie answered. And Steve was referring to peer review, and clearly, as Laurie said, it's probably not the role of this committee to advise the Department of Education on peer review. On the other hand, we've got leaders of three associations: Felice Levine from AERA, Stephen Breckler from the American Psychological Association, and Laurie Wise, who's president of NCME. And I think it's very appropriate. In my experience, federal agencies have historically often come directly to associations and asked for that kind of expertise and input from the associations. It has an awful lot of benefits. When these associations can pull the leading thinkers in the fields of assessment and measurement, not just maybe the most popular flavor of the day as an expert or someone who's going to be sympathetic to a particular perception. So I think whether it's a state agency, whether it's a federal agency, whether it's an association, that going to AERA, APA, and NCME for that type of expert opinion has an awful lot of upside in terms of providing really objective, fair, impartial, and sound advice. So not just in that particular situation, but I know in the past I worked at the American Psychological Association, and when I did, they were very involved in advising and helping all branches of government, state and federal, in those kind of matters. And I don't know what their response would be if asked, but I certainly would encourage anybody who's doing something like that to begin by asking the associations. And now we're coming to a close, so in closing, I'd like to introduce Felice Levine, who is the Executive Director for the American Educational Research Association. AERA is also selected to be the publisher of the standards, and for that, we're very grateful. Felice?
Thank you, Wayne, and I'm going to try to be attentive to the time and not make closing remarks longer than the opening remarks. How's that? So I really kind of have sort of three forms of thank yous. If it were 5 to 12, I might say, I want to be somewhat expeditious to not stand between you and lunch. And so for those here, I could say I don't want to stand between you and returning to your workplaces or starting Friday early. But of course, we have about 1,000 people who have joined us live web stream. And so it could be taking children to school in the morning. It could be about to fall asleep or maybe even asleep. And the translation questions suggest to me that we have persons from a range of hemispheres and continents, and that's terrific. And in a way, that's what the role of the three organizations and why we have collaborated on the standards for so many years is about. So first, I want to thank the panel. I mean, this is sort of the tip of an iceberg, as everyone has been mentioning. Wayne Camara, who's chaired the management committee that drove the development of the project, and with two just terrific colleagues, Suzanne Lane and David Frisbee. All three have been really seminal contributors as scientists to this field and are members of all three organizations, presidents of some combinations of NCME or vice presidents of AERA. Lori Wise and Barbara, who started on, this is like social promotion. She started on the management committee, and she did such a good job that we kind of partnered her. So if you read the front, you'll see that she stepped down from the management committee. And when Laura Hamilton is I don't know how you actually did it, because while she was on this project, she's the co-editor of one of the ARA highly ranked peer-reviewed journals. So, so thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rand, and your other co-editors. So my second thank you in a way is to the three organizations, and Wayne talked about the collaboration and the enduring collaboration, and I guess by all standards, we know partnerships and relationships we're approaching 50 years, right? Together. 2016 will be 50 years of partnering on standards, and this speaks to, I think, two things with respect to why we have this successful partnership. One is the shared values, and one could sort of put them under the rubric of, I think, something that drives the standards, and that is excellence and ethics. So this really is, and the second, I guess I would say, is responsible science. And I think if there's one thing that kind of characterizes what drives all of us as scientific societies in this project are sort of both of those elements. So there was just, and that's what serves the public good, that's what advances knowledge. High-quality scientists answered the call, volunteered. Technically, we aimed for the highest standards in doing this work, and it was an iterative process of both getting input, as you heard, to the development of the standards, rigorous and repeated input, and peer review. And we all stand for, in science, the highest quality of peer review, and testing and measurement is certainly an integral part of that. And the equally as important, the independence and in the integrity of the process. This was really a project that was created to bring the best of the talent pool together, to work with communities, to work with a range of different areas of expertise to create something that then, in the end, is a living document. And so that's the third thank you, in part to all of you for coming, but equally with a request. At one point, Laurie said, science and the science of measurement and testing and assessment is a continuing project that is never quite done. External conditions change. We had a wonderful question about stereotype threat in the social context. Populations change. The nature of what we're learning and how we're learning it is constantly changing. And so this project, as important as it is, and the standards are extraordinarily important in offering a framework, examples, context, specifics on the tried and true issues and on new issues, but we want them to be used, with my publisher hat, of course, we want them to be sold. But we want them to be used and sold so that we can do another project. And so this is a collective project. We want you to sort of send the word. You have the benefit of having been at the briefing, and we wanted you to have a copy, but we really want you to use the standards, give us feedback, and that's to the 1,000 persons who are online and those who will see this, so that we can continue to perfect and enhance what we do as scientific societies and as a project to serve the public good. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming, and my colleagues. And I would say maybe 10, 12 years from now, it'll be a wonderful, different cast of characters, perhaps, but we'll unfold the 6th, 7th edition of the standards. Thank you.